Hey everybody, welcome back to Grapefruit. This is an interesting episode, I think. It was a lot of fun, since I get to experiment with a lot of things that I don't normally get to experiment with, since most of my videos revolve around either scenery or coaster building, and this is a completely generic coaster. Hell, it's named Grapefruit, so I wouldn't really expect anything from it. But it does allow me to experiment with more generic things that aren't tied to a theme. So I'll be playing around a lot with terraforming and foliage, and in general trying to make this look as realistic as I can. So without further ado, let's get into the time-lapse. Alright, so the first thing that I wanted to start off with is some terra painting. One of the things which I actually really like about the way that the textures work together, I'm not sure to what extent this was on purpose by the developers or to what extent this is just a bit of a weird afterthought. But one of the things that I really like about the way that textures interact is the way that certain textures cannot overlap. There are some textures that really mix together, and some textures that almost repel each other, and that you can barely overlap until you're really dragging up the intensity, which means if you have a very low intensity and especially a large brush size, and you're mixing different textures together that repel each other or that mix together, you can actually get these very interesting fields and clashes between the textures, which in this case, since I'm working with sand textures, I was hoping would sort of make the ground look like you're getting this drifting sand and this mix of sand and soil in a sort of uneven way in the area, as you would kind of have with a semi-arid climate underneath a roller coaster where there isn't really so much gardening. Because this is actually something that has always sort of been something that I've been noticing, is that a lot of coasters get very lush foliage around it. You see scenery everywhere, but in real life we also have our parks like Six Flags, which don't really put anything around roller coasters and just keep it to the roller coasters themselves and keep the ground underneath the roller coasters either just grass or just some sand and mud, or in the worst case scenario just a parking lot. Now I don't know, I don't quite want to go as far as putting this coaster over a parking lot. That's something that I think just by, I'm not sure if dignity is the right word, but merely by self-respect. I don't want to build a coaster on a parking lot, but I did want to play around more with the idea of a coaster that isn't so touched up everywhere, a coaster that's really about the coaster itself and where you can tell that the landscape otherwise hasn't really been meddled with and it's just left over to the elements, which in this case, the coaster is supposedly placed somewhere in a semi-arid climate, somewhere around the Mediterranean probably. So it gets a similar sort of landscape thanks to that. Now I'll be playing around a little bit more with that on the later stage when I'm getting the foliage in. But first I also wanted to experiment a bit with fences and paths. So I'm bringing in some custom path textures just to make the path a little bit more flexible and make it look a little bit more organic as well, sort of the way that it flows around the coaster. But also some custom fences, and one of the pieces that I actually fell in love with are these half wall pieces, which you're supposed to use for stations, because they open up a gap which the station platform can go through when you're building a wall around your station. But in this case they actually work out perfectly for paths, since one half of the wall is actually invisible underground, and the other half is like the 2 meters that are actually above ground, which means that if you're rotating it, you actually stay perfectly connected to the wall that you placed before it. So it actually saves you a lot of time, because usually if you're building fences or path curbs like this, you have to constantly make the walls fit together. But if you're using this wall, you can actually just shift it half a meter or half a grid space, I suppose. If you've placed the wall before it, then rotate it and it will stay perfectly connected to the wall before it. So that was a neat little trick. And also I wanted to get a bit more into some simple custom fences, which are just iron fences keeping the people out of the area where the coaster goes. But they are also quite fancy, I suppose. They do have some decoration in the form of some stone pillars over there. And of course there's some foliage around the area as well. Now I want to take a little bit of time as I'm building the entrance sign to plug a series that I've plugged before, but not in this sense. To plug Planet Brocoaster, because it's an amazing series, but one of my favorite videos coming out of it recently was Bro Basics number 2, which is about foliage and landscaping. And it's a really good tutorial actually. You might not be able to tell from the title, but it's a tutorial on doing foliage. And it doesn't so much go into detail of exactly building all kinds of foliage, but more general rules of thumb and patterns that you should keep in mind when you're doing your foliage. One thing that I thought was particularly interesting that I never really thought about before, and something that really starts to make sense if you hear the name, is they brought in the word nature, which stands for nature. That's not really nature, it's man-made, but it supposedly kind of looks like nature. It's a little bit organic, it's a little bit random, it's all planted, and it's all put on show. It's all presented to the guests of the park in an as beautiful manner as possible, but at the same time it's trying to be natural. It isn't natural because it's completely man-made, and it's all neatly arranged in that sense, but it's trying to be quite natural. So that's something which I actually put a little bit in these bushes, although this was recorded a long time before that tutorial came out. I definitely recommend watching it, because watching it will probably instantly improve your foliage skills, if you can call it that. It definitely did for me, even though I've been at this kind of stuff for many years. So I greatly recommend watching that video, but especially the points about nature was something that I thought was very interesting. The very basic premise is that you've got actual nature, which is just completely natural and honestly often quite boring. Then there's the nature, the man-made nature, which looks like nature, is a little bit more organic, but also a bit more interesting and blunted. And then there's the actual, completely man-made foliage, which you'll see around parks like Epcot's, which is the gardening. Really lines of flowers or perfectly lined trees, things where you can very easily tell that it's man-made. But it's still quite neat as well. But these are 3 types to keep in mind, and as a general other rule of thumb to keep in mind about them is that they're also increasingly expensive. So one thing that came up earlier in Brocoaster is that color is expensive and green is cheap. So putting flowers everywhere in neatly arranged patterns is beautiful, but the average park will not be able to actually afford all of that. And nature is a little bit more expensive than nature, but looks a bit nicer in your park as well. Anyway, with all that said about foliage, I need to catch up really badly. So what I did in the time that I was talking about foliage is I built a quick sign saying grapefruit in the same colors as the coaster, because that's kind of a bit of a trend for generic coasters. If you haven't really got anything to theme it around, I suppose you can just give the fences and accents of buildings around the color, or around the coaster, the same colors as the coaster itself, and at least there's a very clear visual connection between the coaster and the scenery around it, even if it's very cheap and simple. So we've got that in. Same kind of goes for the fences, as I'm just adding some very basic detailing to the queue. Again, this is all also very cheap. I guess the idea would be that if Grapefruit were to exist in a real park, it's not the cheapest coaster since it is B&M, but it's not really the Disney World of this world. So it's more something like a Six Flags coaster or something like that. So would definitely be themed very easily and in a cheap way. So the queue pretty much just exists of some fences to keep you inside the queue, and some very basic cheap scenery, like some barrels being thrown around, some oil drums, I suppose they actually are, and tires. There's no specific theme to this coaster, so it's really just some random clutter. But I think it works to at least make the queue a little bit more interesting, and realistically, the queue should probably just be very boring for a coaster like this. As much as I am not a fan of boring queues, it's something that in some parks, I suppose you really can't escape them, unfortunately. Now here I'm getting to the sign of the coaster, which in hindsight is something that I'm not entirely happy with. It's for one, it's a very unreadable sign for the size of the font. So you can get much smaller letters with the art pieces than this that are much more readable, but I figured I would just go with this weird sort of slanted modern style because perhaps I suppose it fits the edginess of the coaster, and it's a little bit over the top like that, and a bit standard, generic, industrial like that as well. But it's a bit strange. So I might think about that sign a little bit more and complain about it a little bit more, but I'm probably not going to change it because I'm too lazy to do that. But it's a bit of a weird sign. It's a strange font. I'm not entirely unhappy about it though. I think it looks quite alright. It's just hardly readable, and you have to know that it says Grapefruit in order for it to really make sense. There are quite a few letters in there which, because of the way that everything is slanted, don't really make as much sense. And oh yeah, kind of dressing it up like a cocktail over here, I figured I could just put some grapefruit slices on the corner, because that, I suppose that kind of works. It does add some different color to it, but you know, it's a sign about a grapefruit. What am I really going to say about this? Actually, there is still some technicalities to this, since I had to make this an actual support, of course. So there are some beams on the back, and there is some interesting structure keeping all of this up, with wooden planks that all have slightly different colors and are kind of offset to make it look a little bit more natural. And the same sort of very slight slant in the planks as well. And at the back of that, the actual structure that's keeping the sign up are the iron beams that actually hold up everything and connect it to the ground. So yeah, it's a simple sign. It probably could have been quite a bit better, but still, in the end, I think it does fit the coaster alright, so I'll probably keep it around. So with that out of the way, I wanted to get back to this area over here and do a little bit more of path work. Especially some of these fences. These are some of the metallic fences that I actually hardly use, but that are very common in theme parks to keep people from going into the area where the coaster actually goes, because they're hard to climb over, and they just fit the generic style as well. If this were, say, a jungle ride, I would probably have a log fence or something that's related to the theme, but if your coaster is generic, or at least generic enough, I think metallic fences are really the best option, since this is really safety, not scenery. And the biggest priority, safety should always be #1 priority, but the biggest priority is keeping the guests safe, of course. So hence some metallic fences over here. And I actually did leave some space between the fence and the curb of the path to put in some very simple foliage as well, so I'm actually pretty happy with that. I actually forgot to mention one quick tip about foliage that'll make your foliage 10 times better, believe me. Theme park designers will hate you for this one. It's just to make the ground underneath the foliage muddy and soily, instead of just leaving it grass or sand. Especially if you have a grass park, just adding a bit of soil texture underneath your foliage can make a world of difference, especially if it's really the sort of planter-like arrangement that I have going on here along the side of a path. It just adds a bit to the realism and makes it actually look like it's supposed to be there instead of being some sort of weed. So yeah, we have some very simple shrubs being put there, obviously in the area of the coaster itself. I don't quite want to make the foliage as heavy, but I still wanted to put a bit of foliage over there because it was still looking a little bit too empty otherwise. Also, something that I experimented with quite a bit over here, that I have been experimenting with before but never really showed off in a video, is the idea of actually putting tall grass into parks. I quite like the idea of tall grass because I just like the idea of 3D grass, and it's one of the things that I sort of miss in Planet Coaster, although understandably it would totally ruin the performance of a park. You cannot have an entire theme park with 3D grass everywhere. But still, it's something that I really like the idea of, so I've always been experimenting a little bit with 3D grass, and one of the best methods I think that works for it is this yellow flower that you can recolor, and flowers kind of look like grass sprites, so if you actually color the flower, not in a flower color, if that makes any sense, but into a dark grassy green, you can actually have something that looks a lot like grass, and that's something that I'll be sinking quite a bit into the ground to add all these tiny sprites of grass here and there. It's not something that really works that well if you want to make an entire field of grass. It'll, for one, really lag because you're gonna get tens of thousands of bushes very quickly. I've tried this and it didn't really work that well, but at least you can get some small sprites here and there to have some large grass tufts, which is quite nice and something that adds a bit of depth into your ground shrubbery. Because in many cases you don't really want to have ground shrubbery everywhere, but you don't want to leave your areas completely bare, like just some sand or completely flat grass I think is quite boring as well, so adding these small tufts here and there at least adds some texture and depth to those areas where you can't really put anything else. It also comes back to the idea of just being natural scenery and not something that's really maintained by anybody, so it's just gonna overgrow and have lots of large grass in the field, and that's definitely something that I wanted to have with this coaster as well. Although maybe someday I'll actually try and make something with a complete field of 3D grass, or perhaps one day Frontier might add it. I'm not really sure if that's a great idea, but if it works, it would be really amazing. But for now, I'm actually quite happy just adding small tufts of grass here and there. Speaking of Frontier, there's actually some interesting news that I've been wanting to talk about. I'm not entirely sure how much I'm allowed to say this by Frontier, but I like to say it anyway. So basically you might know that Frontier does watch a lot of videos and all kinds of other content that comes out about Planet Coaster, and it has really influenced the way that the game develops. And like they like to say, it's a game that was almost in parts built by the community itself, because the community really shaped what the game, what directions the game takes. So in that spirit, knowing that my videos also get watched quite a bit by Frontier employees, I would like to kind of admit that I started this coaster to complain a little bit about the coaster creator in the game. The same kind of goes for the Smooth College Planet Coaster College Coaster tutorial. The Smooth Coasters Planet Coaster College tutorial, there we go. Because it's something that's been bothering me for a while. I still like the coaster creator as a whole, but just the transitions between the different nodes, the fact that it lacks continuous roll and that it lacks a hard line, are issues that have been bothering me quite a bit, because the coaster creator could be almost perfect. At least it could be perfect, but right now it's like they just didn't dare to take the last steps to make it perfect. And finding some kind of solution, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure myself what it would be, to get the coaster creator to be more smooth and resolve the issue where you don't notice anymore when the coaster goes from one node to the other, one track piece to the other. That would be amazing, and that's one of the reasons why I started this coaster as a bit of an experiment, to see how smooth things actually can go in Planet Coaster, what the issues are, and what a coaster would actually look like if it were a lot more smooth than the standard coaster creator actually allows us to do. The same kind of goes for the camera as well, because one of the reasons that this method does work out is the fact that the camera anticipates different track pieces, so it really moves in this weird way, which works out in its advantage in this coaster, since the track pieces are all 4 meters, so there are very subtle movements that make the coaster look a bit smoother. But in general, the camera and the coaster creator being quite unsmooth are some of my major gripes with the game. But the good news that I wanted to talk about is that this has actually been delayed to the Frontier office quite a bit, because recently I've seen the community managers actually go onto Discord and take a lot of ideas and recommendations and requests from a lot of different people, and one of the most common requests was to make the coaster creator smoother and fix some of the issues that I've been talking about in my recent videos, and that have just been going around the community as well in general, because I don't want to make it seem like it's just an issue that's coming from me. It's just, personally, for me, it's one of my biggest gripes and things that I would like to see changed. But it's now at Frontier, and the idea is there. And we'll see if it gets picked up, if in the future something happens. I've recently seen a video by Variable Gaming, which I'll link in the description, where he talked about the fact that coasters have seemed to get smoother. He wasn't entirely sure what it was, but something apparently has happened that has made things smoother, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it is either. It's a very subtle change in the camera, it appears. But yeah, it's good to see that stuff is happening, and they know about the issues. And also, like he said, things right now are quite a bit better actually than in the first alphas, so there definitely is an upward curve in that sense. Also, I'm gonna sort of link that video because I've been needing to shout out his channel in quite a while, because he makes some really amazing smooth coasters, and pretty much every day he has a coaster coming out. So definitely go check out his channel because he makes some awesome stuff. Now, finalizing my video over here is just mostly pathworks, which is a little bit boring, I suppose, especially to do it, since it takes quite a bit of effort to do it this way. But I just wanted to have some subtle changes in pathworks over here and make the layout a little bit more fluid and organic. And also have some slightly different textures. What you'll often notice around theme parks, especially the theme parks that choose to go for some of the cheaper methods of doing their path system and just go for concrete and asphalt and tarmac, is that you have like the split of slightly different textures. You'll either see different large plates of concrete or have slightly different colored asphalt textures, stuff like that, but very subtle changes in path texture. It's something that you don't really have in Planet Coaster, since you just have a limited array of path textures that are all clean and perfect, but it's the sort of imperfection of the path that I wanted to try and get in here a little bit, while at the same time also changing the layout of the path a bit as well. I'm not sure if I'm actually gonna use this space to build a building, because it's definitely a plaza that seems built in a way that it needs something at the end of it. Like, this cannot just be an exit path plaza. But that said, I'm not really sure how far I'm gonna go in that, because this is Grapefruit, and the focus is on the coaster itself. And to be very honest, I don't really want to build an entire park around Grapefruit. That would take way too much time. I don't think it's really worth it, and this is mostly an experiment in the coaster builder and trying to build a semi-realistic coaster. On the topic of which, though, it is definitely not a standard B&M layout, but that's an entirely different discussion, which I guess I could go into for a little bit. There's the discussion between making realistic coasters. There are some people that really like to make coasters based on the exact layouts that they have in real life and make some variations on that. While on the other end of the spectrum, there are people that make complete fantasy coasters that don't really base themselves on manufacturers and what kind of layouts and shaping of the track they have. And I feel like I like to exist somewhere in the middle between that, and it's interesting because it's a topic that I rarely talk about, but something which I think is really a signature of what I like to do, is that it's somewhat based in reality. It's a coaster that could be built by the manufacturer, and it's at least believable to that extent, but it's definitely a completely different layout, and there's no B&M Flawless that really looks like this. Although some people have said it looks a lot like Hair Razor, which is fair, definitely with that color scheme. And although this was entirely accidental, it looks a lot like Grapevine in Roller Coaster Tycoon 1. I didn't even intend that as some sort of obscure reference, but I'll definitely take it. I love Grapevine, and never during this building did it ever occur to me that it looks a lot like Grapevine. So that was just a coincidence. But still, Grapevine is awesome, and Roller Coaster Tycoon is awesome, so I intended that reference, I'll say. Anyway, that's been it for this episode. So thank you guys for watching and staying through all my strange rants. And I'll end the video with a quick cinematic shot, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next and the last episode of Grapefruit.